who are our leadership examples in this movie? What does leadership look like in this Iron Man movie, and how does Tony break out of his "it's all about me" mindset? Is it just circumstances?
Well, I think like most of us, Tony breaks out because he has this experience that changes the way that he views the world. It changes his perspective of everything. And that experience obviously starts with his capture, as the movie frames it at the beginning, by these terrorists, and he's in this cave for this month. But that in and of itself probably isn't enough for Tony to have this realization. Of course, he has the moment where he sees the Stark Industries logo on the missile next to him when he's lying on the ground, shocked. That's great, but there's more to the realization. The realization that what he has created is being used to do harm is not the full realization. I think for Tony, for him to become the kind of man that makes the sacrifice that he makes in the first Avengers movie, and of course in Endgame, there has to be a spark. And I would argue that that spark is Yinsen. Because in this, again, Brian, you set up beautifully that Tony's more of a Luke Skywalker. And when we see a Luke Skywalker type character, he's not really a leader, more so a hero. What we want to look for is, as magnanimous leaders, where's the Obi-Wan?
Yeah, it's a time honored movie trope, but it's also a powerful thing in our actual lives, right? The person who is an example of a different way to be. So Tony's experience, as you say, sets him up to question a lot of his assumptions, right? What he thought he was doing with his life, what he thought the purpose of his technology was, and just to kind of opens his eyes to like what's it like to be on the other end. But then what do you do about it? How do you behave in the face of terrible things? How do you behave in the face of questioning your assumptions? Really, he only has this one sympathetic voice in the movie that gives him an opportunity to think about things in a different way. And Jensen has some really great lines about purpose, but he also just by his basic actions, like takes care of this person that he doesn't know, saves his life, and then risked his own life to help him get out. Risked his own life. It would have been a lot easier for him to collaborate with the captors than to collaborate with Tony.
Oh, it's beautiful. Like you said, we could have chosen so many different moments to talk about here, but Yinsen, I mean, he has these quotes, right? He says, "So you're a man who has everything and nothing."
And he's talking about Tony doesn't have a family, right? He's not married, he doesn't have kids. He's lost his parents, as we find out later on, right? That's kind of the immediate context, but the real context is like you don't have a purpose, like you don't have any reason to be better than you are. You don't have any reason to do the things that you're doing. This really is at a moment where probably Tony needs to hear that, but that's also I think a thing that we can all be thinking about, like who are we doing things for? What is from where does our purpose derive? And that doesn't necessarily mean to be something spiritual. It's just like who are you taking care of? Like who is benefiting from your actions? And Yinsen really challenges him with that. And of course, in movie fashion, of course he is killed in the process of the first act of the movie here. But the reveal that like he didn't even have anything that he was going back to, right? It didn't necessarily change his, he sort of transferred his caring to Tony just as in context, like because that's who he was, that's how he's portrayed. But that's a lesson that Tony really needed to learn. He didn't have that example in his life. We don't have. He has lots of people caring for him, right? He's got Potts, he's got Happy, but he's got Rhodey who's sort of shepherding him around. But he doesn't have anybody that he respects, that he observes caring, that he wants to emulate until this point in the movie.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passing of the torch. Again, just like Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, where you have Obi-Wan making the sacrifice and Luke watching so that Obi-Wan dies so that Luke can escape, and he willingly makes the sacrifice. And of course, that moment ends up transforming both Darth Vader and also Luke. And it's only in the infinite wisdom of Obi-Wan that he could see that like it's not his fight at this point. He needs to be the one who stays in. And that's what we see with Yinsen. Yinsen said this was always the plan.
Right.
Yinsen is the wise man who can see beyond what the young, passionate, energetic, and again, lots of great traits that Tony has. But the traits that Yinsen has are the traits of an actual leader, of somebody who can make a difference in the world, versus Tony has a lot of power, but what is that power actually doing?
And so I think what we talked about a little bit in the pre-show, right? The arc of this story is Tony turning into a hero, right? The arc of the story is everything from self-centered Tony with the glass of scotch and the Hummer talking about the Maximum Cover Girls to Tony standing on the podium at the end saying, "I am Iron Man." Like,
Mm-hmm.
but in order to get to the "I am Iron Man," somewhere in the middle of this movie, he has to realize he can't be Tony anymore. He can't be that version of Tony Stark anymore. He's got to let some of those things go, or he's got to pick up some purpose to align to in order to get there. So, what does that look like? How do we do that? How do we examine ourselves to decide where we maybe need more purpose or need to alter the focus?
Well, I want to touch on one thing here that happens, because a lot of this stuff feels like it, in my life, some of it just happens to you, where you get put into a crucible in one way or another, and that crucible then forms you. This seems to be a shared experience, hence why, books like The Crucible are extremely popular, and there is a like heavy motifs of refining
Mm-hmm.
by fire, even if it's humans and not just metals, need to be refined by fire. There is concepts of, suffering is partly the point, because suffering and pain is, within reason at least, is how human beings are grown into the type of people who can be like Yinsen, who can
We
stand
have
in and make that sacrifice. And I have to call out this moment because I just am seeing it right now, and it's beautiful. That the obvious point, the obvious mountaintop we could look at is on the way out when Yinsen says this was always the plan, and he runs in and he does the Leroy Jenkins and protects Iron Man so that he can escape. And then you have this emotion from Tony that he actually cared for this guy, and he actually believed in the values that this guy believed in, and he understood him. So it's easy to say that it's the moment is when Yinsen sacrifices himself and dies so that Tony can escape. But what if we look back at the previous moment when they come in there the day before and they're investigating him? Tony's over here saying that he's building the Jericho missile. And then Yinsen is defending him, even though Tony is refusing to tell Yinsen what's actually up most of the time up until this point. Yinsen also asks him, and Tony, a lot of the time, isn't even being fully transparent with Yinsen. But he holds the coal out, and he's claiming that he's going to put the coal in Yinsen's mouth. And Yinsen, to Tony, that is terrible, and he's squirming. And you see Yinsen there, and of course, that suffering is not lost on him, and yet he's willing to accept it.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. There's a moment there where Tony at least sticks his neck out for somebody else. He's like, no, 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 I need this guy. Like, oh yeah, he's a good assistant, right? That's kind of how he passes it off, right? But yeah, that's maybe the first time in the entire movie where we see him taking any action on behalf of anybody else.
Yeah, and it only happens because of Yinsen's character, and it's that character that we cultivate, that we put out into the world, that allows others to have the boldness to grow, where you put somebody else's growth before your own growth, like Yinsen does for Tony, that allows Tony to become the hero of the universe, basically.
Right. Yeah, and so we have all these fun, tech inversions, about he starts with technology that is just for killing people, right? And then he has to, out of self-defense, build technology to keep himself alive. And then he sort of bootstraps that into, okay, what do I do with this now? Like, how do I benefit other people with technology, right? So it's a well laid out progression, right? It's a very satisfying, silly little comic book movie. But these are real things, right? These are real leadership challenges, and these are real problems that we all run into. Where is my purpose? Like, who am I helping? The thing that I'm working on, what is it actually going to do in the world? And have I spent even time thinking about that? We probably don't do that as often as we should.
Agreed. Agreed. We all have a bit to learn from the Yinsen, the Gandalf, the Obi-Wan. And I think it starts with making sure that we have those people in our lives and that we seek out those people. I have tremendous empathy for those that I come across that are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to have good character, and yet they've never had a mentor like that in their life. They've never had somebody who would bend over backwards for them. They've never had somebody who would put their development before that person's development. And of course, it starts with learning at the foot of somebody like that and ends with becoming somebody like that for others. And it's not a 1-2 step progression. In order to be able to do that, it is a lifelong finding your Obi-Wan and being an Obi-Wan to somebody else.